Hi, my name is Jerry Kroth. I'm a psych professor in California, and this is about global warming. And you might say to yourself, what does a psychologist have to contribute to global warming? So let's take a look at this person.
Some scientists talking for global warming. I don't think that it has been established yet as a fact that global warming is the issue of the day. And I think that at this point,
Now, Michelle Bachmann wanted to become president of the United States of America. And denial is a psychological defense mechanism, which is actually a very serious defense mechanism. It means that you live on Fantasy Island, that you have lost contact with reality. So there are a lot of psychological issues involved in this topic. So I wrote a book. It's called Duped: Delusion, Denial, and the End of the American Dream. A delusion is a crazy idea, a crazy theory that you have about the world. For example, we thought that Saddam Hussein had something to do with Al-Qaeda at 9/11, and we thought that he was making nuclear weapons. So those are false ideas. Those are called delusions, false theories about the world. And when you act on a delusion, an individual who does that is usually mentally ill or on his way to mental illness. We went to Iraq, 6,000 miles from our shore. We killed thousands of people based on two false ideas. That's a delusion. So this book talks about 6 major American delusions, and global warming is one of them. So let's begin with the psychology here is that people on the right tend to engage in a defense mechanism called denial, like Michelle Bachmann. People on the left tend to have another defense mechanism, which is called displacement. That's a little harder to explain and a little more controversial. So let's start with the easy one first. Here are the people in our media leading us into the denial of global warming. These are the major propagandists, if you will. But there are dozens and dozens of people who are on the American screen, radio, television, telling us that there is no such, that global warming is a hoax, that it's a liberal conspiracy, that it's something that's being debated. Rick Santorum, who was also running for president of the United States, said global warming is, quote, absurd junk science. Okay? So here's a little piece from Fox. Looked like Al Gore was Godzilla blowing fire on a city. So this propaganda blitzkrieg, by the way, Canadians, about 2% of Canadians believe that global warming is doubtful. Okay? Almost 30% of Americans believe that it's doubtful. From all political spectrums. I mean, this propaganda blitzkrieg is enormous. Take a look at this one.
Are you real concerned about this global warming?
I'm only concerned about the incredible frenzy and hype for something that's a total myth. That concerns me a lot because people are going hysterical about it. It's amazing to me how upset so many people are and how many billions of dollars apparently our governments are going to spend of our tax dollars to combat something that isn't real. That has my attention, believe me. As a scientist, I know that global warming doesn't really exist at all in any sense of significance, and that we have nothing to worry about.
Oh, doesn't that make you feel better? So let's go to a slightly deeper analysis of this. Now, I don't want to be accused of overgeneralizing, but there is a partial truth in what I'm saying here, that there is a kind of social contract that exists A lot of the American media is owned by rich people and rich conglomerates. The New York Times is owned by a rich family. The Washington Post is owned by a billionaire. The Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune are owned by a billionaire. If you take your car and you drive far out into northern New Mexico, you turn on the radio, you hear a lot of static, but then all of a sudden you get Clear Channel. Clear Channel is everywhere. It controls virtually 80% of everything heard on the radio in the United States. These are some of the payees of Clear Channel: Michael Savage, Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck. Who writes their checks? Because all of these guys are global warming deniers. Now, Bain Capital owned Clear Channel, and the prior partner of Bain Capital was Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney is worth $260 million. He is in the top 1% of the top 1% of the elite American wealthy class. And he, at one time, was writing the checks to Michael Savage, to Rush Limbaugh, to Glenn Beck. Here's a little bit of Michael Savage.
As I can tell, there is no man-made global warming. It's a scam to control businesses and impose the highest tax in American history. It'll cripple the nation, destroy us.
So the social contract seems to be, we are rich people and we don't want anyone to take any wealth from us or to tax us, and we want to become richer than we already are. And global warming is inconvenient. It threatens us with regulation, with taxation, and so we have a network that is paying these orators and rhetoricians to tell you that it doesn't exist, that it's a hoax. Now, it's not just Michael Savage. He reaches 8 million people every day. Rush Limbaugh reaches 20 million minds every day. Glenn Beck, 7 million minds every day. So this is a huge propaganda blitzkrieg of denial. So you can't. The effects of this constant propaganda is that it gets internalized and assimilated, and then people develop delusions. For example, among Republicans in 2012, 67% say that global warming is exaggerated. Thank you, Michael Savage and Glenn Beck. You earned your paycheck. Wonderful results. Among Republicans in 2011, 73% of staunch conservatives said there is, quote, no solid evidence for global warming. That is a huge propaganda victory for someone. Among Republicans, 57% do not believe scientists believe global warming is occurring. Now, that's a huge amount of people who we are thinking are in denial. But what if we're crazy? You know, you have to go to Iraq and study the question and say, well, he wasn't making weapons of mass destruction. And then you realize that you suffered from a delusion. It's only when the theory is proven false that you can say you have a mentally ill person or a mentally ill public who are operating on the basis of a false idea. So what are the facts? Who's crazy here? Maybe they're right and we're wrong. And I'm saying you or we as an editorial we. So let's find out. So carbon emissions now are greater than they have been in the last 650,000 years. 27% higher than they were ever recorded. How did they find that out? They dug an ice core in Antarctica. They pulled it out and sliced it and saw air bubbles in the little sliver of ice. And in those air bubbles, which can be dated, they can determine the amount of CO2. So I told this to a friend of mine who is a right-wing Russian engineer from Silicon Valley. He said, bad science, bad science. This is not good science. He doesn't believe in global warming. And I said, why is that bad science? He says, because it's not replicated. It has to be replicated. Okay, so they actually replicated it. They dug another ice core. This one went back 800,000 years.
So from ice cores we can measure what the temperature was in the past from an instrument like this, and we can also determine what the carbon dioxide concentration, for example, was in the past from the bubbles that we talked about earlier. The oldest ice core we've got is 800,000 years old, and this plot shows the temperature going from ice ages down here up to warm periods up here, and it also shows what carbon dioxide was doing at the same time, and carbon dioxide was also going up and down, so the temperature was making the carbon dioxide rise, the carbon dioxide was making the temperature rise. And perhaps the most interesting thing on here is the sharp rise at the end here in carbon dioxide, which is what happened in the last 200 years, where it goes up to levels that are unprecedented in the last 800,000 years.
Well, there we have a replication of a scientific study that says the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is greater than it's been through all the ice ages that we have, all the way back 800,000 years. So are we still looking at some more facts? Are you still not convinced? Well, in 2003, 90% of scientists believed global warming was real and due to human activity. That means that 10% had their doubts. Okay, now that survey was replicated in 2011, and scientists changed. Now, 97% of scientists believe that global warming exists and it's human-induced. Only 3% are dissenters. Now, that weatherman from Fox News who said he's a scientist and says there's nothing to worry about, he belongs to a fringe group, you could call it lunatic fringe group if you want, that involves 4 people. In other words, of those 372 PhDs who were polled, 4 thought that global warming was not real. Okay, and the other 1,368 thought it was. So, but that man who is on Fox News, he's on television all the time, probably on a daily basis. And so is Glenn Beck and Michael Savage. And that propaganda arm of the corporate media is incredibly powerful in shaping attitudes and beliefs and leading the population in the direction of denial. But there are more facts here. The number of record highs exceeds the number of record lows by 2 to 1 in the last decade. Sometimes in the middle of the winter, just notice there will be a record low in Wyoming, and Sean Hannity will get up there and say, see, a record low. How can you talk about global warming? Well, the total number of record lows and the total number of record highs, there's a 2 to 1 imbalance. There are twice as many record highs as record lows in the last decade. Still not a believer? Okay, another fact for you. There have been 327 consecutive months where global temperatures exceeded their long-term averages. Imagine a stock that was consistently above its 200-day moving average. That's a pretty good stock. Well, we have 20 years of data that shows that the average monthly temperature is in excess of its baseline. Still not a believer? Okay. 11 of the past 12 years have been the hottest since 1850. Do you see a trend? Are we getting through? No? Well, in the United States, forest fires have consumed 6.5 times more acreage than they did in the 1970s. Could be global warming, or we could have a plague of arsonists. All right, a plague of arsonists. 2 separate studies predict that the summer ice in the Arctic Ocean will be completely gone within the next decade. One says within the next 3 years, another says within the next 8 years. Now, the last time there was no summer ice in the Arctic was 125,000 years ago. Okay? That is the very birth of Homo sapiens. Okay? For the entire length of our species history, this situation has not existed, but it will come into existence within 3 to 8 to 10 years. Okay? Now, if none of those facts have convinced staunch conservative Republicans. And it's still a liberal hoax and a liberal. Take a look at a picture. Sometimes a picture is more convincing. That's the North Pole in the summer of 1979. That's the North Pole in the summer of 2003. And at the bottom, that's a picture of the North Pole in the summer of 2010. And if you can't see a trend, and you can't see what is obvious, you're either blind or you're in denial. So we have a large segment of our population that is convinced that they live in a different world. They live on Fantasy Island. They live out a delusory world in which denial is the largest contributing factor to their consciousness on this issue. So they've lost contact with reality, and to that extent, they have an incipient collective mental illness, the same way an individual would have one. Now, the left. This is a harder argument to drive home. So what the left is using another mechanism of defense called displacement. But first, let's at least honor the left by saying they are not in denial. 80% of liberals believe there is solid evidence for global warming. Okay, congratulations. 64% say it is a very serious problem, versus 73% of conservative Republicans who say it isn't. So there's a vast difference of opinion on this subject. So we have to applaud the left for that. So what are we talking about with displacement? Freud has a few defense mechanisms he talks about, and one is called displacement. It means that you are it's a much healthier defense mechanism than denial, by the way. But it means you're redirecting an impulse away from the source and towards some other outlet. So, for example, you have a problem with your boss at work, and it makes you frustrated and angry. The appropriate behavior would be to deal with that stress at your job with your boss. But that's a little more dangerous. If you come home and you see your son is playing a lot of loud rock and roll music, you go to his room and suddenly you become extremely angry and quite negative in dealing with your son. And you get some anger out, but it's misplaced. It's displaced anger. It's directed at your son or at your dog. It is not effective because it is not directed to the source of the problem. So that's a clinical example of displacement. How does that relate to global warming? Well, if we look at the left, the mantra of the left generally is be the change you wish to see in the world. So the leftist liberal agenda, if you will, is to reduce, to recycle, to reuse, to change your light bulbs, to plant a tree, to eat locally produced food, to buy energy efficient appliances, to have an ethical caring about how you eat and how you consume, to diminish your materialism, to proceed with the thought of becoming vegetarian or vegan, to plant drought-resistant plants instead of a lawn that eats up all that water. So what's wrong with that? That sounds kind of admirable. It's certainly something that should be honored and respected. Well, the fact is that it doesn't work. It isn't working. United States carbon emissions were up 3.9% in 2010. World carbon emissions are up 29% since 1990. The rate of carbon emissions in the United States is triple the rate it was when President Clinton was president. So you're doing something like the man who was upset by his boss. He's doing something, but what he's doing does not address the problem. And it's displacement because it is not being effective. Let me develop this argument before you get up and walk away, all right? Here's Atherton, California. It is a very, very rich Silicon Valley city. It is totally loaded with Democrats, liberals, Sierra Club members. The average income in Atherton is about $70,000 to $75,000 a year. It's affluent, it's liberal, it's green. Okay? Humboldt County is colder. It's a county, not a city. So there are 70% Democrats in Atherton. If you smoke in Atherton, you probably do not have any friends at all. Okay? That's how liberal Atherton is. Humboldt County is also liberal, but not quite as liberal. There are a few more Republicans in Humboldt County. It's only 60% Democratic, but it's half, about half as rich as Atherton. $40,000 median family income. But it's colder. It doesn't have the microclimate that Atherton has. So you would expect Humboldt County would use more electricity, would be less conscious of its of environmental issues compared to the wonderfully conscious Atherton, and you would expect the carbon footprint of Humboldt to be greater than Atherton. Wrong. The Atherton carbon footprint is 30% greater than the Humboldt County carbon footprint per capita. They use 30% more electricity in Atherton than in Humboldt. Why? Well, let's talk about the idea of talking the talk and walking the walk, okay? So here's a portrait, a hypothetical portrait of a person in Atherton, a liberal, a wealthy Silicon Valley liberal. He has a home, and he said, hey, I have converted my hot tub and bought the most energy efficient hot tub pump that exists in the United States. We threw out our refrigerator, okay, and we bought the tree hugger. It costs $9,000, but it is the most energy efficient refrigerator sold in the United States. This is what we have done for global warming, and we resent this talk about displacement or whatever this psychobabble stuff is. We do. Look, see that energy efficient air conditioner? I ripped out the air conditioner in our house and bought the most expensive and the most energy efficient air conditioner that is sold in this country. What have you done? Okay? So the person in Atherton would take great offense at what I'm saying and what this whole idea of displacement. I've done more for global warming than you have. What have you done? Have you cut back on your meat consumption? What? Just tell me. I have spent a fortune on global warming issues. I'm a member of Earthwatch. I'm on the board of directors of Earthwatch. What can you say? That's the thinking. That is the mental state of many, many people. Now, as we say in psychology, we were trained to say this. Thanks very much for sharing. Okay? And we're happy that you said all that. There's one problem. All of your indignation, all of your rationalization, all of your talk doesn't make reality go away. You are using 30% more electricity than they use in Humboldt County because you have more money, more flat screen TVs, your iPod is plugged in, your Prius is plugged in, you have 4 flat screen televisions in all of your house, you have air conditioning units in every room, and you have a hot tub pump and a swimming pool pump. Okay, you consume more. Okay, so you think you're doing something about the problem when in fact you're contributing to it and you're not doing something about the problem. Now that point of view is not very popular. So let's take it out of the personal realm. Don't leave yet. Watch this. Imagine here the same idea, but this time we're comparing the United States and Mexico. Mexico has 1/3 the population of the United States. Okay? So let me digress a second. Walking the walk and talking the talk. Talking the talk, but what you're doing is not walking the walk. You think you're walking the walk when in fact you're not. That's what we're kind of defining as displacement here. Mexico has 1/3 of the population of the United States. Let's talk about talking the talk. We have almost 20,000 organizations devoted to the environment in the United States. Conservation, Drought, Sierra Club, Earthwatch, you name it. There are 20,000 such organizations. Mexico has 62. Okay? We have 300 times, not 3 times, 300 times more organizations educating children about the environment, about global warming, about conservation, about recycling than Mexicans have. Okay? We are so green compared to Mexico. We should congratulate ourselves for being so enormously more versed in all of the issues of global warming. We are talking the talk beautifully. Let's talk about walking the walk, though. Is electricity consumption in Mexico a third that of the United States? We have 3 times more people than Mexico, and we have lots of organizations. Are we using 3 times more electricity? That's talking the talk. Sorry, we use 15 times more electricity than Mexico does, even though we have only 3 times the population. This is the same problem between Atherton and Humboldt County, only at a more national scale. Compare ourselves to Brazil. Brazil is a very up-and-coming country. We have twice the population of Brazil. And guess what? We have 20 or 30 times more organizations devoted to the environment than they have. Not twice as many, 20 or 30 times more organizations studying global warming and concerned with conservation than Brazil. We are greener than Brazil on paper, much greener. Okay? Do we use twice as much electricity as Brazil because we have twice the population? Sorry. We use 17 times more electricity than Brazil. Brazil is a modern country. It is the biggest economy in South America. The Brazilian economy is bigger than all of the other South American countries combined. It is a vibrant economy. And we use 17 times more electricity than they do. We have more Priuses, more iPads, more hot tub pumps that are operating. So that is the issue that the left is really not coming to terms with. So if we start facing reality, there are lots. I mean, when you have a delusion, you go to a therapist, and the therapist sort of straightens you out, and you regain your reality contact. How do we do that? Well, first we have to recognize what happens if we continue down the path of denial on the right and down the path of displacement on the left. Okay? Here's what scientists say. Well, if you're between 20 and 30, this is the reality that you will deal with when you're retiring. Okay? Diseases like malaria and yellow fever will finally reach Europe and North America. 1 million species will have gone extinct. No more tigers, pandas, rhinos, sturgeon, alligators, parrots, sharks, gorillas, tunas, elephants, leopards, polar bears, gazelles. Your children will look at photographs of them, and so will your grandchildren. The Caribbean ecosystem will collapse, and agricultural production in South America will decline by 50%, so say scientists, because the glaciers which supply the water for that agriculture will have dissipated to that extent. Wildfires and droughts, hurricanes and cyclones will be run-of-the-mill events. Melting of the Himalayan glaciers will impact 500 million people in India and China who depend on water runoff for survival and for agriculture. Changes in ocean currents could, scientists don't know how to predict 30 or 40 years into the future, so give them a break, all right? But one thought is that the currents, that the Gulf Stream will change, and this could turn Europe into a landscape very similar to Siberia. So, another aspect of facing reality is to say, how do we stop this? Well, the two greatest sources of carbon pollution in this planet are the United States and China. Together, these two countries are responsible for 42% of all carbon emissions on the planet. These are the two culprits, us and them. China and the United States are about the same size geographically, but one country has about 4 times as many people. But we have to stop the United States, and we have to stop China, and we have to do it soon. And the question is, how do you do that? If we start with us, how do we reduce our emissions back to 1990 levels or 1985 levels? That is something that would be a tough road to hoe. Well, let's start talking reality contact here. If we reduce the price of, to reduce gasoline consumption by doubling the price of gasoline, instead of $4 a gallon, it'll be $8 a gallon. That's about what they pay for gasoline in England. What if we suddenly said all gasoline in this country will be taxed at 100%, and the price of a gallon of gasoline will be $8 a gallon? Well, the United States burns more gas than the next 20 countries combined. This could reduce our gasoline consumption by 40%. But guess what? It would not reduce our carbon emissions by 40%. Okay? It might take 2 or 3 percentage points off our total carbon output. It would not solve the problem of global warming by itself. Okay? This has been suggested by very few people. A few. You don't even know. I mean, there are very few voices that we are aware of, because Glenn Beck is dominating the airways. We don't hear these people. Can you name a single senator or congressman who says, let's double the price of gasoline? No. We could ration electricity. Power plants are responsible for 30% of U.S. emissions. Okay? So the people in Atherton are told, you have so many kilowatt hours that you're allotted. This is what happened in World War II. So you have so many kilowatt hours. That's it. So if you want to use your electricity effectively, you're going to have to shut off 3 of your 4 flat screen televisions. You can air condition 1 room, not 7. Okay? You have to shut off your hot tub pump and your pool pump, unless you want to live in a house that's dark for the last 7 days of the month. Do you know anyone who's recommending that we ration electricity in this country? I don't. I can't name a single person. But there are a few voices. And even if we rationed electricity, that does not end the problem of global warming for the United States. It simply takes off a few percentage points of our carbon footprint. There are 97 million cattle in the United States. 18% of our greenhouse gases come from farting cows. Okay? So, and they're farting methane, which is 72 times more insidious than CO2. So if we rationed red meat from 9 pounds a month, which is what the average American consumes, to 4 pounds a month, you can only buy so much. We will also not export red meat to anybody. Okay? We're cutting way back, and we're culling the American cattle herd by 20%. Okay, we're reducing that 97 million down by 20%. Here's a little video on this
P of
issue.
carbon dioxide is defined as 1. The warming potentials of all other gases are ranked in comparison to CO2. The GWP of methane, for example, is 72 when averaged over 20 years. In other words, methane heats the atmosphere 72 times more than CO2 over the course of 20 years.
The reason that it's a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is because the structure of the molecule traps more of the infrared radiation, more of the heat.
Where does methane come from?
Human methane emissions are from meat, they're from livestock.
1 cow produces 200 pounds of methane each year, an equivalent of 14,400 pounds of CO2. Due to intensive livestock raising, there are today more than 1.53 billion cows in the world, each emitting 200 pounds of methane, leading to an astounding 21.6 trillion pounds of CO2 equivalent emitted annually.
This is more than
3 times the world's cars, all the power plants in the world, all the emissions of industrialized nations of Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, Japan, United Kingdom, and United States combined.
So I suppose you could say, well, I don't eat red meat, or I've cut back on red meat. That's fine. And that is an ethical decision on your part that is certainly to be applauded. But can you name anyone in the United States who is proposing that we ration red meat and that we cull America's cattle herd by 20%? I can't name a single politician in Washington who's standing up for that. Okay? And even if we did that draconian measure, we would only knock 2, 3, 4 percentage points off our carbon. That does not solve the problem. It is only a piece of the puzzle. There's a man named Lester Brown who wrote a book called World on the Edge. And if you can read that book and not be frightened to death, I admire you. He tells it like it is. He's a good scholar, okay? And his prescription for this country, Plan B, is completely different than the kind of things we hear from right or left. It is so completely radical. He doesn't say think globally, act locally. He says the paradigm is think globally, act globally. So, for example, he said that what we need to do to solve the problem of global warming is a completely different sense of collective resolve. In World War II, we mobilized this country. We didn't make cars in 1941 or 40. You can't buy a 1942 Chevrolet, okay? They didn't make them, okay? We converted all of our automobile factories to the war. If they made marbles, that company started making bullets. And within 3 years, the American economy virtually transformed itself. He said, well, that's what we have to start thinking about. We have to go onto a war footing. People planted victory gardens. They ripped up their lawn and started planting vegetables, okay, because it was necessary for society to do that. Roosevelt thought if we did it, we could make about 60,000 airplanes, military aircraft. We, in fact, made 239,000 military aircraft by converting our economy. And he said, that's the kind of solution that we need to be thinking about. And it's far more radical than anything that's being proposed. For example, Brown says, if you took 100 square miles of the Nevada desert and put a solar farm there, that would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Right now we have demonstration projects that involve 50 acres. He's talking not acres, 100 square miles of solar farm. He said that would generate, on a sunny day, enough electricity to power the United States of America. Imagine the technology exists, but the resolve doesn't. The politics is not there. But there is. I mean, that would be like building 239,000 military aircraft to destroy Germany. Okay? T. Boone Pickens is an oil man. He says, we have an incredible natural resource. We have tornadoes that start in Oklahoma, go all the way to the Dakotas. It's a wind tunnel. If we put up a wind farm, we could generate a tremendous amount of electricity for our country. But cities and counties and states have their own regulations, and they're not going to let those things up and you have to get permits. And unless there's a federal dictum of eminent domain that says this must be done, it's a national emergency. So there is a possibility that could happen, but it's not. Then there are also politically incorrect solutions. Nuclear power excuse me, nuclear power is kind of dangerous, and Americans don't want nuclear power. They certainly don't like fracking, and it's not. But if you develop the attitude that of Lester Brown or maybe Malcolm X, remember Malcolm X? By any means necessary. If we say we have to be focused on this problem, and we just can't take easy solutions, we have to take even politically incorrect solutions. China is building, by the way, China currently is building 27 nuclear power plants. 60 are under construction worldwide. The United States is considering building one. Nuclear power produces 20% of U.S. electricity. It could produce more. And once we've solved the problem, maybe we could decommission those things. Another unpopular item is fracking. And certainly fracking is very, very controversial. And the thought that it is releasing fugitive gases makes it even a worse possible a solution, or no solution at all. However, fracking has reduced the price of natural gas by about half. And when a coal power plant converts to natural gas, it immediately reduces its carbon footprint by 30%. There are coal-fired power plants now in operation that converted to natural gas, and their carbon footprint has retreated back to 1985 levels. Natural gas could be a temporary solution, hopefully without fracking on the agenda. So, if gasoline prices were doubled, electricity and red meat rationed, massive solar farm investment, massive wind farm development, immediate expansion of nuclear plants, conversion of all coal-fired plants to natural gas, the United States could reduce its carbon footprint back to 1985 levels, probably before 2019. By the way, we spend on research, global warming research, wind, solar, etc., 1/400th of what we spend on defense. Our priorities are so skewed considering the danger that we face. Okay? So, it is not to be disappointing or pessimistic or nihilistic to say that this cannot be done. It could be done. We simply do not have anything close to the national resolve that is necessary. Now, we're only solving half the problem. China has a higher rate of CO2 emissions than we do. They're responsible for 23% of the planetary total. That's a big chunk. China burns more coal than the United States, Japan, and Europe combined. 75% of China's electricity comes from burning dirty coal. Their coal is about 10 times dirtier than ours. 800 million Chinese burn coal in their homes to stay warm in the winter. It is a lower grade coal with higher sulfur emissions. China is building 2 new coal-fired power plants every week. So, there are 10 million diesel trucks in China that are spewing soot, sulfur, and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. Their diesel-fueled trucks are 130 times dirtier than a diesel truck cruising along the streets of Los Angeles. Okay? Now, when we go to Walmart and buy a product, almost everything for sale in Walmart comes from China. It's made in a power plant that's burning coal to turn on its lights. It's shipped to a port in a diesel truck, and then it comes to Walmart and it's on the shelf, and you buy that Barbie doll. Now, China generates what is called the Asian brown cloud. The Asian brown cloud is sometimes 3 kilometers thick and can cover as much territory as the continent of Australia. All right? The Chinese brown cloud is responsible for 25% of the air pollution in Los Angeles. Okay? The soot reaches the poles. The poles become darker. The ice melts more rapidly, and the whiteness of the polar caps becomes darker.
All that car exhaust and pollution from power plants and factories, all that smoke, soot and ash from cooking food and burning crops, it all has to go somewhere. And that somewhere is here. From the ground looking up, it's the heavy blanket of smog which seems to be an almost permanent fixture of many Asian cities. From satellite photos looking down, it can be seen stretching across India, China, and beyond. Scientists call it an atmospheric brown cloud, a toxic cocktail 2 miles deep, covering tens of millions of square miles from the Arabian Peninsula.
All right, so China is said just a year or so ago that they plan to increase their electricity production 14%. Okay, found that in the Wall Street Journal. Nobody seemed to care about that. But that means effectively that China plans to burn 14% more coal than they're burning. They produced 95 million tons of coal in 2011, and they hope to produce twice that much by 2012. When, if they produce it, it's going to be burned, right? What, is anybody talking about this? Is anyone doing anything about this?
Do not adjust your set. These are the latest pictures from the Chinese city of Harbin after being shut down by smog on Monday. The World Health Organization recommends daily levels of particulate matter with a diameter of 2.5 micrometers to be no more than 20. Anything above 300 is considered dangerous. Levels around 1,000 were recorded in some parts of Harbin. All schools were shut and the airport was closed. Harbin is home to some 11 million people and lies in the northeastern Heilongjiang province of China. Other parts of northeastern China also experienced severe smog. Visibility has reduced to only around 10 meters, causing huge traffic jams. China's leadership is concerned about air quality because it is a constant source of public anger.
All right, so is it possible to stop Chinese CO2 emissions? How would we do it? What, are we going to go and bomb their coal-fired power plants? Are we going to go to war over this? How do you do it? I mean, are you going to send an emissary and say, please try to burn a little less coal? Or are we going to try to raise consciousness? Do we have that much time? So what if the United States considered legislation to prohibit trade with gross polluters? Do you remember when they were catching tuna and they were also catching dolphins? People got very upset that dolphins were being caught by tuna fishermen and killed. And so they passed legislation immediately saying you have to use a certain kind of net which will allow a dolphin to escape and not kill dolphins. That happened very rapidly, okay? And the tuna industry adapted very rapidly. So now you get your tuna and you're quite sure that dolphins were not killed to bring that can of chicken of the sea tuna to you. Major culprits here are Walmart. Walmart is China's 8th biggest trading partner. Its trade with China is larger than most countries. So when you buy products at Walmart, Target, Best Buy, JCPenney, GM, Mattel, Toys R Us, you are buying products that were made in coal-fired power plants where that electricity for that factory comes from that source, delivered in those trucks, and you have to stop, or we have to create some kind of legislation that stops this. Some people say it should be an international carbon tax that would make Chinese products 30 or 40% more expensive. Okay? But whether it is prohibition of trade with China or a carbon tax, it is not a serious alternative in our present political set of agendas. But it is about the only thing that we can do short of war. So let's go back again to the issue of facing reality. And I would like us to do to come back into psychology. Here's a girl who was 17 years old. She dropped out of high school. She got involved with drugs. She got involved with crystal meth. She's now 19. She left home. She's homeless. It is rumored from a friend of a friend of a friend that she's been prostituting herself. She's living on the streets with her boyfriend, prostituting herself. recently the police came to the parents' home with an arrest warrant because she was party to stealing someone's televisions sets. So, okay, let's talk about denial and displacement. Mom is doing denial. Dad's doing displacement. What does that look like? Mom says, I don't want to hear this about my daughter. I know who my daughter is. I love my daughter. I know that children go through phases, cycles, but she is not doing the things that they say, and I don't want to hear about the things that they say she's doing. I know that children go through phases, and she will come home. She's a decent human being, and I don't want to hear any more about it. That's denial. Now, Dad, he is much more informed. He's the displacer, okay? He says, no, I know that these things are happening. I know the story about the theft. I know about the crystal meth. I know that she's been doing heroin. I know that she's homeless. And I'm not in denial, that's for sure. So what I have been doing is I have been going to church every day. I have renewed my faith in Christ, and I go to Mass every single morning. That is one of the things that I'm doing that I think is helpful to me, certainly, and hopefully to her. And the second thing that I'm doing is that I believe that she got involved with a rogue teacher in high school, and he introduced her to crystal meth. And I'm suing the school district, and I'm spending most of my time on that litigation. That occupies every square, what am I trying to say? Every free moment of my free time in that litigation. Okay, thanks, Dad and Mom. We appreciate that. You can't fault Dad for going to church, can you? You can't fault Dad for suing the system and bringing an irresponsible teacher to justice. The trouble is, neither Dad nor Mom is doing anything to help the daughter. Have you noticed? Okay? What does the daughter need? The daughter needs a private detective who is going to find her and get her off the streets. She needs to be put in a homeless shelter so she will be under some degree of protection. She needs to be put in rehab, and somebody needs to come up with the money for rehab so that she can get out of her drug addiction. And she needs a lawyer who's going to represent her with these charges by the police that she's a thief. None of that is being done. Okay? What the identified patient is needing is not being done. And what we're talking about here is what the identified patient is Mother Earth. And what is being done for Mother Earth is not working. So, if you add right-wing denial into the equation, and then you add in left-wing displacement into the equation, you come to the conclusion that the majority of the population of the United States is not engaged in the behavior that is necessary to address this problem. Let's go to the Vietnam War for a second. Do you remember in the Vietnam War there were kind of two schools of thought? There was the thought that was promulgated by the Beatles, that to stop the war we need to transform ourselves into peaceful, nonviolent, loving people. Okay? So this was the view of the Beatles, that by making personal changes in our own selves, in our souls, we would think peace and we would have peace. But the other point of view was an activist, revolutionary point of view, radical, that said we have to take to the streets, we have to stop this war. There were demonstrations. Kent State, the moratorium day, and it was the demonstrations, the activism that put an end to this war. To some extent, this activist voice is not being heard at all. It receives no publicity in our culture, in our country. So let's have another kind of a guided fantasy, all right? Because I know that this displacement idea is very controversial to many people and they don't accept it. So let's try this on just for size. Obama meets a Martian. Obama is informed, he's liberal, he's not stupid about the issue of global warming. And the Martian comes to talk to Obama and says, You're president of the most powerful country on earth, isn't that right? Yes, yes, I am. So our question to you is, why aren't you doing anything about global warming? Oh, no, we're doing lots of things about global warming. Really? People are changing their behaviors, they're changing their light bulbs, they're becoming far more conscious. We have school programs in elementary schools, secondary schools, we have doctoral programs in environmental sciences. We are raising consciousness like anybody. I mean, it's amazing what we're doing. And then the Martian says, but you see, we monitor the gases of your planet. And if you see that black line, those gases are, can you show me on that graph where you have done the things that you say you have done? Because those are the gases that are coming off your planet. And Obama says, well, I don't see anything in that graph, but you can't say that we're not doing things. We are doing amazing things. Look at Denmark. I mean, they have just about revolutionized their whole country, in Germany too. I mean, we have a thing called Earth Day. We celebrate the earth and the growing green consciousness that is of environmentalism. There's a thing called the Kyoto Accords. 192 nations agreed to, what did they agree to? Did they agree to slow? No, they agreed to reverse their CO2 emissions. Well, can you show us on this graph where they reversed their CO2 emissions? Well, I don't see it, but that only goes up to 2000. I mean, in the last 10 years, it's amazing the changes. Well, President Obama, we monitor the gases of your country and your planet thoroughly. So between 2000 and 2010, your CO2 emissions went up another 7.5%. So we don't see the things that you are talking about. But he says, okay, are you getting the point here? The Martian is telling us we're not doing anything, and we think we are, but the results are not supportive of that idea. So, we're getting nothing for our efforts.
A laboratory in Hawaii started tracking atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide in 1958. Then there were 316 parts per million. This red sawtooth line shows the annual fluctuations, but the overall direction is clear. 55 years later, those levels have now peaked at over 400 parts per million.
No one, I think, can be aware of what's going on and think that we are going to avoid serious and probably dangerous climate change in the future. We have to get ready for that.
So
we're hitting the planet in a very, very dangerous way. And I just hope a headline like 400 parts per million just might trigger a little bit of shock in people, because you should be shocked. What are we doing?
For the last 20 years, scientists, governments and businesses have been talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide. But few countries have made any meaningful changes.
That conversation has been going on now for several decades, and what we see looking at the atmosphere is really no change in the behavior with this accelerating rise.
So the voices that are talking about this much more radical solution here are people you don't hardly even know. The Food Climate Research Group. They talk about rationing red meat. Richard Heinberg, James Hansen, Kel Caldera, T. Boone Pickens, Ralph Nader, you know, Lester Brown, you have a little acquaintance with. They don't get on television. They're not broadcasting on the radio like Glenn Beck is every day. These are very, very minority voices in this country and around the earth who stand for the things that we have been talking about. So, what are we going to do? What could we do? Is it possible? Yes. Double the price of gasoline in the United States. Whoa. Ration red meat and cull America's herd by 20%. Unheard of. Stop the export of red meat. It's not good for business, Michael Savage will say. Ration electricity. Oh my God. What are we going to do with our hot tub? massive national development of solar farm on the scale of World War II's global economy. Rapid deployment of natural gas conversion of all coal-fired power plants, regardless of the cost, regardless of fracking, and the development and the speedy development of nuclear power. Massive development of wind farms and associated infrastructure. Increase of federal research and development by a factor of 10. Cessation of all foreign trade with gross polluters, particularly China, or the implementation of an incredibly steep carbon tax that would virtually shut the Chinese economy down, except the Chinese economy has $3 trillion in reserve, and you can buy scrubbers, and you can change those diesel trucks, and if you can't sell Barbie dolls at Walmart, then you may need to start converting that coal-fired power plant to a natural gas, be certified by the United States, and then you could re-export your Barbie dolls. An agreement of all major trading partners, the EU, Japan, to boycott Chinese goods until these CO2 emissions come down. One CEO of Wisconsin Energy said, anything that we do in the United States, if everybody bought a Prius, it will not stop the world output if China does not stop its CO2 emissions. So, do you remember the Wall Street 99% movement? Well, the 1%, the 99%? Well, the capital of that organization, which is now a vestigial remnant of what it used to be, is in Oakland, California. Okay? However, there are ships that come to Oakland, California, carrying imported goods from China and offloading them in Oakland. There are no demonstrators saying, stop trade with China. There are none. Okay, there is no movement to stop this. And this is the only thing that we can do to make some kind of progress on Chinese emissions, short of war. Walmart has, those are the stores that Walmart has opened in the United States. The Walmart heirs, 6 Walmart heirs have more money in their little pocketbooks than 100 million Americans. Okay? The Walmart heirs to the Walmart fortune. And there are no pickets around Walmart stores saying stop selling products made in China. No such consciousness. And those heirs to the Walmart fortune are certainly not very enthusiastic about laws or regulations or taxes or carbon taxes or anything which would impede or inhibit their ability to do the business they're doing with China. And if they have any connections with the media, they're certainly going to be supportive of Glenn Beck and Michael Savage and the others who say that global warming is a hoax. There are no demonstrations ringing America's coal-fired power plants that are spewing this soot and CO2 into the atmosphere. No demonstrators saying, please convert to natural gas immediately. Where is this public consciousness? People are driving SUVs to Trader Joe's and wherever else they go, and the average SUV in this country gets 16 miles per gallon. Okay? There are terrorist groups, environmental terrorist groups, who set those SUVs on fire. Okay? But there's no peaceful movement to inform people that they should not be buying SUVs that get 16 miles a gallon. It is not good for the environment. So the unhappy news here is, what if it's too late? Okay? Do you remember this graph? All right. This was a graph that I showed you before. You notice that little blip? There is a 2% drop in CO2 emissions on around 2008. You can see that. That is the first drop that the human race has produced in 50 years. Okay? The first one. Now, what was that? Was that because we were green? Was it because we had Earth Day? Was it because finally enough people became conscious of the problem? No. The person responsible for that is unfortunately George Bush. George Bush the Ayn Rand capitalist who believed in unregulated capitalism, set off an orgy of speculation in the banking industry. There was a global collapse. The Great Recession happened. Industrial production fell. 8 million people lost their jobs. 3 million people lost their homes. China slowed down its coal burning because they didn't have their export markets were drying up. That was caused by the global recession. And that's the only time the human race ever did anything that started to reduce it. Okay, well, in a way, good, right, okay? However, you remember the scientists who said there's a perfect correlation between CO2 and temperature, CO2 and temperature. They go up and go down. So if we had a blip in CO2, did we have some environmental relief? I don't think so. 2 years after that blip, there were forest fires in Russia that were 300 forest fires a day. It destroyed 40% of their wheat crop. Where was our good news? Weren't we supposed to have some relief from our blip? I mean, if we rationed red meat throughout this country, maybe we could make a blip. Are we going to see some relief pretty soon? In Pakistan, after our blip, there were floods that engulfed 30% of the country. It was the biggest flood in 100 years in Pakistan. In 2011, there were such severe tornadoes in the United States that 500 people died. There were only 11 people that died from tornadoes in the prior decade, but there was that kind of huge tornadoes we've never seen in this country. The drought in the United States in 2011, I think it was 2012, 1/2 of all the counties in the United States were declared federal disaster areas. 50% of all the counties in the United States. Okay? Where was the relief that comes from our blip? I don't see it. Do you see it? Is it possible that it's too late? When are we going to see some, remember the typhoon that that we talked about at the very beginning of this talk? That was the biggest storm that Scientific American said that was ever recorded. Where is the relief that comes from our bringing down our CO2 emissions by 2%? It's not there. Scientists are scaring us with another thought too, and that is that the top meter of the tundra in Siberia and in northern Canada contains methane. If that top meter melts, it will release methane into the environment, which is 72 times more toxic than CO2. Scientists call it the Arctic carbon bomb. Okay? It's the equivalent of 200 trillion kilograms of carbon in the top meter of Arctic tundra. So while Larry Kudlow is saying, drill, baby, drill, and the Republicans are saying, look at all the opportunities in the melting Arctic for exploiting gas and oil, the melting Arctic reduces the Earth's albedo. It warms up faster than the rest of the Earth. The tundra melts, the methane goes up. Have we reached a point of critical mass where even our most draconian measures might not reverse this process? 1/3 of the U.S. population lives snugly under a blanket of media propaganda, believing global warming is over-exaggerated, a liberal hoax, a liberal conspiracy, and that it poses no serious threat to them in their lifetimes. A larger segment of the American population believes that global warming is a problem and that they are making a genuine contribution to it and doing their part in transforming their personal lives in order to help the planet. They live inside a delusion and are only dimly aware that their collective activities have produced no substantive reversals of the American carbon footprint whatsoever. And neither of these two segments of the American population, which is the majority of the American population, have any plans or strategies to deal with China's global emissions. The planetary crisis is real, it is severe, it is acute, the human race is in danger, the damage may already be irreversible. America has effectively descended into paralysis, either denying the problem exists or pretending its efforts have some chance to reverse this disease. To lose contact with reality is a form of mental illness. To suffer delusions and denial in the face of a crisis is a form of mental illness. To live in the fog of denial, delusion, fantasy, and dreams in the face of bona fide danger, threatening one's fellow man and oneself, is a form of collective insanity. Thank you for your attention.